Good day. My name is Shannon Goris, and in this reflection, I will discuss my grade 10 English home language lesson titled An Introduction to Romeo and Juliet. The purpose of this lesson was to introduce learners to William Shakespeare and prepare them for studying Romeo and Juliet. Before learners begin reading the prescribed text, it's important that they understand why Shakespeare is still relevant today, become familiar with some features of Shakespearean language, and recognize the universal themes that appear throughout the play. The lesson was designed around three learning objectives using Bloom's taxonomy. Firstly, learners had to identify words and phrases introduced by William Shakespeare and explain their meanings. Secondly, learners had to recognize that Shakespeare's language is still relevant in modern English and explain one of the key themes explored in Romeo and Juliet. Finally, learners had to analyze examples of Shakespearean language and explain how these features contribute to understanding the prescribed drama. The lesson was divided into three phases: the introduction, the development, and the consolidation. During the introduction, I used a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation to introduce the lesson objectives and facilitate a partner discussion. Learners were asked questions such as what they already knew about Shakespeare, whether they recognized any famous Shakespearean quotes, and whether they believed Shakespeare was still relevant today. To make the lesson more engaging and relatable, I also included a short clip from the 1996 Romeo and Juliet adaptation starring Leonardo DiCaprio. This demonstrated that Shakespeare's stories continue to influence modern films and popular culture. This activity activated learners' prior knowledge and encouraged participation and generated interest in the lesson. The development phase formed the main teaching section of the lesson. Using the PowerPoint, I introduced learners to Shakespeare's influence on the English language by exploring common words and expressions that originated from his works. Learners were then introduced to features of early modern English, including pronouns, verb forms, and sentence structure. I also explained concepts such as iambic pentameter, figurative language, allusions, and Shakespeare's use of wordplay. Throughout the lesson, I encouraged discussion by asking learners questions, inviting them to interpret examples, and making connections between Shakespeare's English and the language that we use today. By using visual examples and guided explanations, this helped simplify concepts that learners often find challenging when it comes to Shakespeare. For the consolidation phase, I used a Shakespearean insults activity included in my PowerPoint presentation. Learners interpreted the meanings of selected insults and discussed how Shakespeare used creative language to develop characters and create humor in his plays. To conclude the lesson, learners completed a short activity in which they identified one new Shakespearean word, one expression they recognized from everyday life, and one reason why Shakespeare is still studied today. This allowed me to assess whether the lesson objectives had been achieved. The primary ICT tool that I used throughout the lesson was Microsoft PowerPoint. Rather than simply presenting information or bombarding them with activities, the PowerPoint combined text, images, discussion questions, and multimedia into one interactive learning experience. The film clip also helped learners visualize Shakespeare's work and appreciate its relevance in a modern context. According to the SAMR model, this introduction activity represents augmentation because the PowerPoint presentation was enhanced through multimedia by including the modern film clip that helped enrich the learner's understanding. The development activity represents modification because PowerPoint redesigned the traditional literature lesson by integrating visuals, structured discussions, and interactive examples that made abstract learning concepts easier to understand. The consolidation activity also represents modification because the PowerPoint transformed a traditional revision exercise into an interactive class discussion supported by visual prompts and learner reflection through the final activity. Throughout the lesson, my role as the teacher was to facilitate learning, explain new concepts, encourage discussion, and ask probing questions, and provide guidance whenever learners required support. The learners were active participants throughout the lesson by engaging in discussions, analyzing examples, answering questions, taking notes, and reflecting on their learning. The lesson also accommodated learners with different learning abilities. Visual learners benefited from the images, diagrams, and PowerPoint slides. Auditory learners benefited from class discussions, teacher explanations, and the film clip. Learners who needed additional support were assisted through scaffolded explanations and examples before encountering Shakespeare's original text. Partner discussions also encouraged collaboration and allowed learners to learn from one another. Overall, I believe this lesson successfully introduced learners to Shakespeare in an engaging and accessible way. Using ICT made the lesson more interactive and helped learners connect Shakespeare's language to their own experiences. If I were to teach this lesson again, I would consider including an interactive online quiz, or possibly using Microsoft Forms at the end of the lesson to provide immediate feedback and further assess learners' understanding. Thank you so much.